So everyone and their grandmother seem to be criticizing postmodernism today. On the right, we don't like it because it is the project of the demonic neo-Marxists that weaponize identity and resist all discipline, basking in ecstasy or wallowing in depression in this world of undifferentiated virtue. On the left, we don't like postmodernism because it seems to be all too quick to accept the logic of capitalist economy, integrating it into seemingly every single aspect of their lives, no longer seeing us as human beings, but only as consumers. At least we can all agree postmoderns are the worst. The problem with both critiques is that they tend to look at postmodernism in a vacuum. They tend to shield themselves off from the messy and idiosyncratic stuff of history that actually has brought us to the historical moment that we find ourselves in today. The human decisions that make up what we call history are not always the product of perfectly executed plan with an exact outcome in mind. Very often they are a result of a particular feeling that saturates a given historical moment. And so the single most interesting question, or one that art is best positioned to answer, is what does it feel like? What are the differences between the feeling of modernity and the felt experience of being postmodern? Standing together, Eduard Manet's Bar at Folies-Bergère from 1882 and Sherman's Untitled film still number 2 from 1977 tell a story more illustrative of our present cultural and metaphysical condition than we might like to think. These artworks are about us. They distill the human experience of modernity and postmodernity, respectively. From the spaces they occupy to their gestures and facial expression, these figures give form to the experience of their time, both historically specific and universally human, making their insights available to us today. One of these insights these artworks provide is about the status of the category of the beautiful at a given historical moment. By beauty here, I mean an aesthetic pleasure that comes from an encounter that honors something good within you, something intelligent and sensitive and noble and generous, feeling of belonging to something larger than yourself without making you feel insignificant, something that feels to honor your humanity in so much of its complexity. When you go to a museum, you notice that from century to century, art looks very different. And then you get to somewhere around 1900s and everything just seems to go off the rails. Why does that happen? If you ask my mother, synthetic drugs happened. But there's also a more nuanced explanation to why postmodernism today feels the way it does. First, to understand what postmodernism is responding to, we need to look at what preceded it. In other words, what was modernism? Modernism is an aesthetic, come philosophical, come political response to modernity, a result of the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th century that forever changed the mechanisms of everyday life, and the aftermath of the French Revolution that forever changed the relationship of men to their government. Modernity is best understood in terms of a radical break with the past. Modernity is the consciousness of one's own newness as a long-standing truth about man's place in the world disappear. By this time, the Enlightenment project and its scientific thinking has finally mounted a meaningful challenge to religious thinking. The human being is no longer imagined as a subject to the divine will of God, or the sovereign power of the king, or the ebbs and flows of agricultural production. No longer is man understood as being deeply interconnected by way of material dependence on the people that surround him, his family, and his community. It has been said that modernism may be seen as an attempt to reconstruct the world in the absence of God. In other words, modernism brings us out of the world of all-powerful God and into the world of all-powerful men. And so the main subject of modernity is a worker, a producer. Understanding this loss of order as tragic, but simultaneously feeling galvanized to rebuild the sense of wholeness, we begin to produce grand stories, or master narratives, conceptual frameworks that aim to outline logical, empirical, secular totality that explains the world, claiming a centrality of a single founding idea. For example, the democratic master narrative explains the world by holding at its very center the merit of democratically elected representative government. Or the Marxist grand narrative that explains the world through the centrality and the importance of the economic production. Or the psychoanalytic grand narrative that explains everything through the centrality of sexual desire within the human behavior.
What is he now? The dirty old man.
In other words, there's an urgent need for a unifying idea that does not fall back on the top-down hierarchies such as church or monarchy. This striving for a logical, clear, and unified picture of the world relies on the transparency, clarity, and reliability of the scientific language of Enlightenment. Enlightenment said, this world around you is completely knowable. It is available to you through your senses and the power of your logic. Very galvanizing, very exciting stuff. And this is why in the modern period we see an explosion of artistic movements, one more outrageous than the other. This family tree of artistic movements by art historian Alfred Barr gives us a sense of frenzy with which the artists strive to give form to a radically new experience of their time. This is people striving to rebuild and reimagine through aesthetic means a sense of wholeness that they feel they have lost in this world. Manet's last painting, finished less than a decade before Barr's chronology begins, anticipates this frenzy. Eduard Manet was a modernist painter working in 19th century France. He is best known for playing a central role in the development of Impressionism and routinely scandalizing art salons by painting ambiguous scenes of working class subjects with an unorthodox painterly style. His very last work depicts a scene in the 19th century Parisian nightclub. We see a woman standing behind bar with bottles of alcohol and fruit, presumably working as a waiter. In a large golden framed mirror behind her, we see the reflection of the interior of the bar, a crowd of rowdy visitors, men and women, enjoying the entertainment for that night. Straightforward enough. Several things might strike you as odd when looking at this painting. First, the scale of the central figure. The barmaid is large, larger than human size, and she looms over you if you're standing right in front of the canvas. Traditionally, large scales were granted to goddesses or emperors. Second, despite her scale and weight in the composition, she does not look mighty or strong or commanding of her space. This woman looks absent-minded, caught off guard, or maybe on the brink of tears or a smile. And of course, lastly, the reflection in the mirror does not seem to be aligned with the objects positioned before it. Everything in this reflection seems to be a little off kilter. What can we say about the world this figure belongs to? We know she's of class lower than people in the crowd, in part because she's in a position of service, but also she is not wearing gloves like the female visitors of the cabaret. Plus, it feels as if she wears her clothes like a costume, decorated to match the products she offers for sale. Look at the way the curves of her black corset echo the contour of the champagne bottles. The lace brim of her décolletage glistens like the transparent glass of the fruit vase. The flower pinned to her chest protrudes upwards with its pink petals ready for plucking. And despite her scale and weight in the composition, she still doesn't feel at home in her role. The nightclub reflected in the mirror behind her is fizzling with excitement, electric light, crowds of middle-class visitors spending their night looking and being looked at, mingling with performers, artists, and business owners. The barmaid stands apart, both integrated into the scene, her head floating against the packed theater balcony, and shielded from it by the marble bar top that cuts her off from the pleasures of nightlife. Her interiority is out of accord with her surroundings. She seems caught off guard, blushing and at a loss, missing something, while the world around her overflows with material abundance and glamour. This split between the outer reality and the inner reality is another distinctly modern phenomenon. And so the overwhelming feeling of the work is one of wistfulness, a desire to hold on to a semblance of order, to something solid in the world that is increasingly speeding up around you. Look at, for example, the way in which the barmaid drives her palm into the corner of the marble bar top, gripping it tight. The urgency to comprehend one's own newness, both metaphysically with the death of God and socioeconomically with the new abundance of lower middle-class jobs, both stuns the modern subject and incites them to action to ameliorate that alienation. The hero of modernism is worker, a producer, a doer. Manet shows the problem with modernity. And in the decades that follow, we see human beings struggle to overcome this problem, overcome this split, by trying to build utopias and surmount the material obstacles and create new world through the sheer power of their will. Yeah, what could have possibly gone wrong? Italian futurist artist Filippo Marinetti is often quoted saying that war is the highest form of modern art. He's not the only one who argued that. With the horrors of 2 world wars and the atrocities of Holocaust and Gulag, the modernist project was forever compromised. With all the power of technological and scientific progress, by the mid-20th century, human beings have set the world on fire. The beautiful tales of glass castles of socialism or the fascistic nationalist excellence bore fruit of genocide and labor camps. Where in this world lies the beautiful? Theodor Adorno famously said that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. So how do you move forward from there? Following the devastations of the first half of the 20th century, the post-war economic boom in the West highlighted the buying power of the population that empowered people to no longer feel their dependence on these grand stories powers that be are telling, but focus on their own personal worlds and acquiring a kind of unity through consumption. Here's how one of the most influential artists of the 20th century, Andy Warhol, understood this newfound freedom that came to define America. What's great about this country is that America started the tradition where the richest consumers buy essentially the same thing as the poorest. You can be watching TV and see Coca-Cola and you know that the president drinks Coca-Cola, Liz Taylor drinks Coca-Cola, and just think, you can drink Coca-Cola too. A Coke is a Coke and no amount of money can get you a better Coke than the one the bum on the corner is drinking. All Cokes are the same and all Cokes are good. So the new subject emerges, the consumer. What makes you you is not so much what you make, but what you consume. The kind of persona you present yourself to be through the various attributes of market goods. What car you drive, what house you live in, what clothes you wear. And so instead of striving for a single universal narrative, we slowly arrive at propagation of differences. If modernism experienced loss of order as tragic, but at the same time harbored a sense of despair and belief in human capacity to overcome this chaos and rebuild wholeness, postmodernist attitude is one of skepticism towards grand narratives and the very notion of wholeness. Postmodernism rejects the possibility of a single truth, embracing the possibility of infinite readings of a single phenomenon. And gradually, as we move through the second half of the 20th century, we begin to think that the assertion of human will over material world, like, say, colonialism, or conceptual world, like, say, language, start to equally be understood as instances of violence and oppression. In an effort to highlight the unviability of any single truth, intellectual scholars such as post-structuralists, with people like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, would demonstrate in a very sophisticated manner that our language has no meaningful relationship to the a priori existing reality, but rather we exist within a closed system of signs that only interact with one another. In her The Politics of Postmodernism, Parody and History, American art historian Linda Hitchen writes, "Postmodernism is fundamentally contradictory enterprise. Its art forms and its theory use and abuse, install and then subvert convention in parodic ways, self-consciously pointing both to their own inherent paradoxes and, of course, to the critical or ironic rereading of the art of the past. Postmodernist art," Hutchin continues, "is precisely that which casts the contradiction of modernism in an explicitly political light." So if modernism is utopian, constructive, and necessarily positivist project, postmodernism is necessarily a negative, deconstructive, and political project. And this is why the works of American photographer Cindy Sherman so effectively stand in as an example of postmodern feeling. Cindy Sherman is an American photographer that came to prominence in 1970s New York. She's best known for a series of self-portraits, for which she takes on a variety of generic persona inspired by female heroines from Hollywood films. She dresses up and poses, plays with camera angles and lighting, creating snapshots that feel like fleeting fragments of a larger story. These film stills feel as if they were found on an editing room floor. Remember how with Manet's Barmaid we were able to imagine the world within which that figure lives, her relationship to her historical moment of 19th century France, her class, her anxieties. Harder to do that with Sherman, in part because we're not entirely sure what is it that we're looking at when we're looking at this photograph. Film still number 2 shows us a woman looking at herself in the bathroom mirror. She is wearing nothing but a towel that she presses against herself with her left arm. She stands in a 3/4 turn, looking at herself over her shoulder, her right arm coquettishly caressing her clavicle. It seems as if she is reenacting a pose she saw in a movie or a fashion magazine, maybe imagining her wrist adorned with a Cartier watch, or drawing attention to a new shade of blush freshly applied to her youthful skin. The photograph is grainy, very grainy. This flattens out the image so much so that it makes it impenetrable. Our gaze almost bounces back at us. Manet's painting is also flat. His brush is undiscerning among objects, but his flatness has texture, a tension between spaces. Another uncomfortable aspect of this image is our point of view. We seem to be looking at the woman from down below, crouching in the corner of the bathroom door. Does she know she's being looked at? Are we witnessing an authentic, private moment? Why the theater then? She is quite clearly wearing a wig. The politics of this work is what contributes to their historical significance. Sherman was interested in staging these moments of feminine cliches as a way of putting pressure on the generic depictions of femininity in the popular culture. One of the central texts of postmodern popular scholarship is Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, the central thesis of which states that gender is not a stable biological category, but a social construct whose interactive performance is what constitutes gender reality.
Well, nobody's perfect.
I bet all that sounds very familiar. Personal is political. The slogan of the second wave feminism encapsulates the political fervor of the postmodern time. Personal, subjective, individual experience acquires considerable aesthetic, philosophical, and political weight. In literature, for example, we begin to see proliferation of memoirs. Martin Ames, in his Experience, a Memoir, writes, "It used to be said that everyone had a novel in them, and I used to believe it. Just now, though, in 1999, you would probably be obliged to doubt the basic proposition. What everyone has in them these days is not a novel, but a memoir." No longer are we focusing on the grand narratives and the world outside of us, we begin to look within. But what are we supposed to do about this proliferation of subjective narratives? To go back to Sherman, looking at this photograph, why would we take her seriously? She is clearly wearing a wig. This is clearly theater. She's imagining herself being a movie star or a model. But on the other hand, why wouldn't you take her seriously? This is a woman facing her own objectification. In the world that commodifies her appearance, women have fought so hard for the right to vote only to find themselves turned into subjects once again. So is she the victim of this cultural system, or is she taking advantage of it? Tricky, tricky. But to see a human being in this photograph, instead of a cluster of media signs, would lead to ask you a different set of questions. To see her as a human being is to acknowledge how vulnerable she is. If someone were to startle her, for example, she would drop her towel and be completely exposed. And have you never found yourself posing in front of a bathroom mirror, rehearsing and winning arguments you've had the other day? You haven't, me neither. Are you not curious what people see when they look at you? Is this desire to appear mysterious and seductive not just another instance of wanting to be seen and by extension loved? Does she picture herself in a tropical island or on a busy city street? Who does she imagine is looking at her? What story does she see herself being a protagonist in? The reason I like pairing these artworks made almost a century apart is that I like to imagine that it took her a little over 100 years to turn around and look in the mirror. This, to me, says something about our experience of history and our relationship to beauty, our constant looking back. Walter Benjamin wrote about an angel of history that has his feet pointing forward into the future, but his face always turning back. Benjamin wrote, "The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress." But when I look at modern and postmodern art, this is not quite the story I see. For my money, the problem and tragedy of this modernism to postmodernism transition is not so much that we are looking at the debris of history and destruction, losing our sense for the beautiful. I think we still want the beautiful, but the problem is that we no longer think we deserve it. There seems to be a need to nurse ourselves back to the realization that we do deserve it, that we are good, not guiltless, but good and with an innate desire for beauty. If you study either of these works at a higher ed level, they will most likely be taught as instances of a uniquely woman's experience of modern world. But I would argue that they stand for a broader range of all human experience. There is something familiar in them, universal and common to all human beings. What they both have in common is that they grasp for the feeling of this desire for beauty, whether understanding that it has been lost and encountering this absence, or having understood that it's been lost, trying to recreate it in the comfort of one's own subjective reality. Neither Manet nor Sherman want us to see capital B beauty in these works, but us, the viewers, along with the figures depicted in these pictures, do.